If you think way back in the book of Revelation, one of the conclusions I came to after we worked through that book for a long time was that the book of Revelation is essentially a redux or a reworking of the Old Testament prophecies in light of the life of Jesus and in light of what the early church was thinking about Jesus, who he was, what his importance was. Now this chapter 38 and 39 has caught the imagination of people who like to talk about end times and prognosticate about when these things are coming. So let's just start reading through it and we'll hear what you have to say. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army, your horses and your horsemen fully armed, and a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, with all the shields and helmets. Also Gomer with all of its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the north with all of its troops, and many nations with you. Now, this business about putting hooks in, we've seen this before in this book, but what's interesting is that often it's an image of hauling people away against their will, and this one it's kind of driving them out as their armies to do some damage. Get ready, be prepared, you and all your hordes gathered around you, and take command of them. After many days you will be called to arms. In future years you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been long desolate. They had been brought out from the nations, and now all of them in safety. You and your troops and many nations with you go up. Advancing like a storm, you will be a cloud covering the land. Okay, so the story of Israel. So Israel, they go into Egypt, they become slaves in Egypt, God brings them out of Egypt, he brings them to their promised land, they're given the covenant, and the whole purpose of Israel, again, is to the Genesis 1 representation. Israel is to be the place where thy kingdom come, which is the kingdom of heaven, begins to rule on earth. And Israel is supposed to keep the covenant, but Israel what? They don't keep the covenant. They were supposed to keep the covenant, and if they kept the covenant, the nations were supposed to come to them, and this was God's plan for the knowledge of the Lord to cover the earth the way the waters cover the sea, as is said in the book of Jeremiah. But now Israel doesn't keep the covenant. Israel fails. Israel, instead of being a light to the nations, becomes just another nation, but associated with God. And so God takes Israel and Judah out and sends them into exile. And then, after this happens, we start getting these prophecies that Israel will come back from exile. In the last couple of weeks, we saw a little bit of that, the Valley of the Dry Bones, and the prophecies. Now we hear that Israel, once it comes out of exile, these Gog and Magog, now this isn't actually terribly mysterious. It comes out of the book of Genesis and the table of the nations. And basically, these are the nations of the north. Let's see, do we have those maps yet? Did we leave them in here somewhere? So if you just kind of briefly, if you look at the geography, there's Egypt down here and the Nile River Valley on the north coast of Africa. You have what we call Palestine here, Israel and Judah. And then, of course, you've got Turkey, what we call Turkey today. And then you've got Babylon, Assyria. And north of them, further to the east, you have Persia, which is Iran today. Well, Gog and Magog, and what they're talking about are all these nations up here. And so this is saying that Israel will once again, after she'll come back from exile, she'll once again be settled in the north, and then God, now notice here again, God will drive these armies out of the north, and they will come down, and they will once again attack Israel. But this time the story will be different. So that's where you have the hooks, and I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and pull you out with your whole army. Verse 4, get ready, you and all your hordes. After many days you'll be called to arms. They had brought you out from the nations, Israel, and now you live in safety. You and all your troops in many nations will go up, advancing like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, now that's key words. I don't know if you remember from the book. Go ahead, Maureen.
I don't want to interrupt you, but some of these people are trying to prophesy that this is Russia invading Palestine. That you probably know.
That's right. So in the 80s, you had Hal Lindsey, late great Planet Earth, 1984, Countdown to Armageddon, and all of those books. And all of those books was reading this passage to say that Russia was going to swoop in, because obviously Russia is up in this territory up here, the Soviet Union, or the fall of the Soviet Union. They were going to rush in here, and they were going to attack Israel. And this was, basically the dispensational Christians. And so then the United States must defend Israel, and then the great battle would be the plains of Megiddo. Now, we talked before about Megiddo and the battle here. If you remember Josiah, this king who led a reform in Judah, Josiah was killed because when Babylon was on the rise, Assyria and Egypt were united to try to counter Babylon, and so Egypt marched its army up from Egypt to join with Assyria and attack with Babylon, and Josiah was afraid of Assyria because Assyria had killed the northern kingdom, so Josiah marched his army out to try to stop Egypt, and his army was destroyed by Egypt, and Josiah was killed in battle. And that kind of set into play then Egypt kind of controlled this territory, but Egypt and Assyria failed to stop the rise of Babylon, so eventually Babylon came down. Babylon put a puppet government in Judah, and then that sets into play all of the things that will happen now with the book of Ezekiel. Judah will try to rebel to gain its independence back, and it will fail, and Babylon will come down and destroy it. First come and take some captives, Daniel, Ezekiel, and later come and destroy the temple, which is what Ezekiel is talking about. And then Ezekiel says, well, Israel will return to its land and be set up, but then the armies of the north will come down, and what's interesting is that the Lord will bring them down. So verse 10. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. So what's interesting in verse 4, it's imaged as hooks in your jaws to bring you down. Now in verse 10, it's imaged as thoughts in your mind to bring you down. You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. So it's, Israel is kind of recovering from the former battles. They're not prepared for war. I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the resettled ruins and the people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the land. Now let's pause there at verse 12. What's the center of the world? Actually, if you lived in the East Coast, you'd know the answer to that. People in New York like to think New York is the center of the world. Why would people imagine New York is the center of the world?
You mean today or back then?
Today.
Well, because everyone from around the world kind of comes to New York in one way or the other.
Why?
Commerce, entertainment, a job.
Commerce, entertainment, Statue of Liberty, a job. Now, Californians might want to put up some of their own contenders. What would the contenders here be in California?
Money.
LA or the Bay Area, right? And so actually the New York, you can find if you Google center of the world, you'll find stories about New York being the center of the world. Now people will argue, well, what about China? What about London? Actually, now, Joanne, you have an older translation. How does verse 12 read for you?
To take a call and to take a prayer, to turn thy hand, how it reads upon the, I don't know if that's place. That's the place that are now inhabited upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have shining cattle and good, and dwell in the midst of the land.
In the midst of the land. It doesn't have the navel, because what's interesting is that living at the navel, actually in Hebrew, they're living in the navel of the land. They're living in the belly button of the land. Now that's a really weird phrase.
Not really. If you a person of vision, pictures, and you know the human body, legs, arms, the belly is kind of in the middle.
That's right, it is. Now, what's a belly button? Where does it come from? From your mother. Because this phrase here is really an interesting one. Because now if you look on the sheets I gave you, let's see, center of the land, you'll see a little bit of treatment of it. And then if you go, I think I put it on this is what happens when I don't take the sheet. Navel of the earth in antiquity. When I talked about New York being the center of the world, I remember seeing a documentary about New York, calling it the center of the world. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, I can understand why they call New York the center of the world, the center of commerce. The 9/11 attacks happened against buildings called what? World Trade Centers. In fact, 2 attacks, World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Now, the attackers of 9/11 were not stupid men. Why did they attack those 2 buildings?
Well, first of all, you hit someone's money, they can't buy anything, so that means a weapon. Second of all, if you take out the leadership, the people are going to be kind of scattered for a long time.
And they tried to hit the White House, and the people took that plane down. But money, armies. I mean, the attackers were very symbolic in terms of what they attacked. Now, calling New York the center of the world really comes all the way back to this verse, calling it the navel of the world. Now, I always draw this picture for you. And I know you probably think, well, why does Paul always draw that picture for me? And I always put Israel down here. And I always put this thing down here. And, the temple of heaven, the temple in Israel. Now, if basically what this passage is saying is that Jerusalem is the navel of the world, is the belly button of the world. If you look at the Latin is very interesting there. It's the umbilici terrea. That's how the Old Testament was translated into Latin. So, what is the belly button? It's where the umbilical cord is attached to the next person. What is this verse? So if you said Jerusalem is the belly button of the world, what would you be saying? Yeah. Jerusalem is attached to the mother. Right? Because the baby is attached to the mother. And now, as that other thing shows, this was common language because the Babylonians said, Babylon is the navel of the world. Americans would say, New York is the navel of the world. Now, that is imaging for us a very interesting picture.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. It's my goal to incite questions.
Okay, so what is the significance of the United States moving their embassy to Jerusalem?
Oh. I think the Palestinians understand that completely.
Okay, we don't.
Why are the Palestinians so against it?
It seems like the Israel has taken a lot of land from the Palestinians. So I don't know if Israel is trying to push them in the ocean or what, but there's an issue with the land. There's some significance. I just don't know what it is.
Well, aren't they both claiming that that's the ancient land going back to the Bible?
Yeah.
So from Israel's point of view, they're not taking the land away from them, they're reclaiming their home.
That's right.
And if the United States, before the United States tried to say, Israel is my friend, but I'm neutral in this land fight. So the embassy kind of was supposed to be kind of neutral and, get this two-state kind of situation here. But once they moved directly into Israel's territory, you can no longer be neutral. You're saying, I'm not neutral. This is it.
And what's interesting about American politics is that Israel has been, that might be changing a little, but Israel has had its political fortune shored up on both sides of the political equation in the United States. On the left, with strong support from Jewish Americans who have Zionist ideas. Zionism says Israel must reclaim its heritage and its past by reclaiming its homeland. On the right, dispensational Christians who say Israel must, see, now we're really getting into the end of the book of Ezekiel, because we're going to have a new temple coming down from heaven. This is why we're talking about the umbilical cord. That dispensationalists read the Bible in a certain way and say that Israel must be restored back into the homeland for their chronology of the end times to be fulfilled. And so the United States is a strong supporter of Israel, both from the political left and from the political right, which is very interesting. There's not a lot of issues like that. Now, there's some trouble on the left because of Israeli treatment of Palestinians and that whole land conflict, or trouble on the left, but this is what's at play in American politics. And see now where this gets into so much stuff. Dispensationalism is a way of reading the Bible that arose in the 19th and 20th century. And if you read books like Left Behind and that whole series, that series is written from a dispensationalist perspective. Okay? And the dispensationalist perspective arises out of a particular way of reading the Bible that also arose late. Because traditionally, well, today is when we are celebrating a Christian holiday that traditionally was celebrated last Thursday. Any idea what holiday I'm talking about?
Ascension.
Ascension Day. Okay. And if you stay for 11 o'clock, you'll hear a sermon about the most forgotten holiday. All right. So, what happens on Ascension Day? Okay, well, let's go back and tell the story of Jesus. So, Jesus is, how does Jesus get into the world? Through birth. But it's kind of a funny birth.
Right.
So what's funny about his birth? Born of the Virgin Mary, which implies what about Jesus' parenthood on the father's side? Jesus is a son of God, right? Jesus is the Son of God. He came from heaven to earth to show the way. We sing that song sometimes. So Jesus comes from heaven through the Virgin Mary, and is born and grows up, and at the age of 30 starts his ministry. And then Jesus gets a lot of people upset because he doesn't seem to fall out in terms of their culture war. And so they kill Jesus. And so that's Good Friday. And then on Easter, what happens? He rises from the dead. And then over a period of 40 days, he appears to his disciples in various times. And then he ascended into heaven. Okay. Here's the question. What does that mean? Why is it so important that Jesus goes back to heaven?
He goes back to the Father.
He goes back to his Father. Okay.
And isn't it also to be sitting on the right hand of God, the right hand of his Father?
He's sitting on the right hand of his Father. Well, what does that mean?
He rules.
He rules. Okay. Now, some of you, again, I keep drawing this picture, and probably, and again, this is something I learned from George W. Bush. Because I used to listen to George W. Bush. I thought, that man repeats himself all the time. But I got to the point of saying, why does that man repeat himself all the time? People remember what is repeated. So I repeat myself all the time. Because we are, and I'm not just talking about you folks, I learned this about myself. I remember what is repeated. This is why commercials work. Why do they keep running the same commercial over and over and over and over on TV?
So you won't forget.
So you won't forget. Okay, that's why I keep drawing this picture. All right, because this is the way, this picture sets up the entire story of the Bible. And we just told the story of Jesus through this picture. Jesus, Christmas, crucifixion, resurrection. But remember, resurrection is not going up to heaven. In fact, when Jesus died and was buried, what does the Apostles' Creed say then? He descended into or Hades. That's a big conversation that we're not going to get into. But Jesus goes into the grave and he descends into the underworld. And there's two interpretations of that. One is Jesus suffers hell for us. Another is Jesus preaches to the Old Testament saints who are in the underworld. Now Jesus leaves the tomb and spends more time with his disciples, and then he ascends into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father. And what that means is that Jesus rules. Well, what does that mean?
Does that mean he's in control?
That's exactly what that means. Jesus is in control. That Jesus, well, okay. So if Jesus is in control, then what?
Well, this is going to be a question from me, from my childhood.
Well, that's good. You've been waiting a while.
Well, you were going to hear all my questions from childhood. One of them was that when Jesus ruled, is the rule when you die and the decision is whether you're going to heaven and hell, heaven or hell? Is that the rule? That was my question when I was young.
The church believed, well, we have this phrase, Jesus is Lord. Well, the phrase Jesus is Lord is actually a changing of another phrase that was common in the Roman Empire, which is that Caesar is Lord. Now, when Christians stopped saying Caesar was Lord and started saying Jesus was Lord, what did they mean?
He's higher than
He's higher than Caesar. And when you say that word higher, you're saying something very important. Which way does Jesus go when he ascends? That means he's higher. That means, well, when they built the Tower of Babel, what were they trying to do? Get to heaven. Why? They wanted to be God, because they wanted to rule. Does God let them build their tower to heaven?
No.
Why not?
Because he doesn't need any partners.
So the whole story of Jesus, so Jerusalem, so the Babylonians say, Babylon is the umbilical of the world. And the Americans say, New York is the umbilical of the world. Now see, in New York we say the center of the world, but that's working in our symbolic brains in a little different way. Because when we say the center, we basically mean everything has to go through New York. And Frank Sinatra sings, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. That's what the center means. It means that there's all these hierarchies. If you're a big deal in Topeka, well, you're a big deal in Topeka. But what do we think about that? Where is Topeka, Kansas? Topeka, Kansas is nothing. If you're a big deal, well, let's see, if you're a big deal in LA, well, that's a lot bigger deal than Topeka. Then the question is, if you're a big deal in New York, well, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. New York is the center of the world. But now notice what we've done with our language. In the ancient world, we would have said Babylon is the navel of the world. That's what Nebuchadnezzar would have said. When Nebuchadnezzar would say Babylon is the navel of the world, what would he mean?
He'd be saying you need to come and meet him for what you want.
Well, see, everyone in the ancient world agreed on something. That the heavens were in charge. Well, let's say I'm good friends with Darrell Steinberg. And actually, just yesterday, Jay Chenier knocked at my door. Anybody know who Jay Chenier is? Maury does. Yeah, he's one of the councilmen. One of the councilmen of my neighborhood. Now, why would Jay Chenier knock at my door?
You want
The election's coming up. And I appreciate this about Jay Chenier. And he came to my door before the last election too, and I voted for him. Because he came to my door and he asked me, are there any issues? And I thought, wow, cool. Great to hear from you, Jay. Talked about some issues, and he said, can I count on your vote? I said, sure. There you go. You bought my vote with your visit. Where you go, Jay. Now, Jay Chenier is on, we would say he's high up in the city. Now notice again the language we're using. He's high up in the city. Where does this language come from? We've always said things this way, haven't we? He's high up in the government. He's high up in the music industry. He's high up in the entertainment industry. He's high up in finance.
He's above all the others.
He's above all the others. Why do we use above? Because, if I'm there's an old trick that people use in offices too, right? You cut the legs off, you have a big desk, you have a big chair, and then you cut the legs short of the little chair in front of the desk, right? So the guy coming in to look at the guy behind the big desk is sitting down here, right? What's that about? Power. It's about power. Psychologists will tell you, people presume that tall people have authority. I learned this when I was in college. I used to work at a lumber yard. I just worked there summers, which meant that most of the other employees of the lumber yard were working there all year round. They knew a lot more about lumber than I did, but people would walk into there, see a bunch of us, and they'd ask me, why? Because I'm tall. Makes no sense. But that's how we default. Why? This is built into us somehow. Now, when we say Jerusalem is the navel of the world, and when I draw this picture and I talk about the Old Testament plan of rescuing the world from rebellion, this is God's relationship. You've got the temple in Jerusalem, you've got the temple on top of the firmament, and the covenant is essentially the umbilical, and Jerusalem is the navel of the world. Babylon says Babylon is the navel of the world. America says New York is the navel of the world. Well, what does navel mean? That means that this is the umbilical, that the power and the authority and everything comes from on high. Now, again, this is an audacious thing for a bunch of people to say in this part of the world. Because, well, what did the Egyptians think of themselves? That's right. Pharaoh was a god who, brought prosperity to his land. Nebuchadnezzar thought, well, he was a god. Now, again, we talked about this in the past. Usually what happened is, let's say, these nations fight Egypt and Egypt wins. How then is that imagined in terms of what we call the heavenlies? Paul, if you read in the New Testament, talks about Jesus taking captive principalities and powers. What are those? The psalmists talk about, praise him above ye heavenly hosts. Who are those heavenly hosts?
Angels.
Angels is almost always the answer. But the Old Testament has words used that are used for angels. And they could say, praise him above the angels. That's not what he's talking about. So, the beginning of the book of Job, God is holding court. And what happens in his court?
Satan and the others.
Satan and the others. You have this entire imaginary in the Bible about these principalities and powers and heavenly hosts. Now, they might be angels in some context, but in other contexts, you look at Daniel 7, which we'll read in an Ascension Day sermon in there. The Ancient of Days sets up thrones. Well, who are on the other thrones? People have been given, not people, powers that are the other powers in the world. But in the Old Testament, there's one central power, and that is God himself. And Jerusalem is the navel of the world because God has made Jerusalem his footstool. This is the entire story of the Old Testament. Now, when you get into these chapters, right there in verse 12, it almost slips by. Nobody pays any attention to it. I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the resettled ruins. These are the nations. And the people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock and good, living in the navel of the world. Sheba and Dedan and merchants of Tarshish and all her villages will say to you, I have come to plunder. Have you gathered your hoards to loot, to carry off silver and gold, to take away livestock and good, and seized more plunder? Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the Sovereign Lord says. In that day when my people Israel are living in safety, will you not take notice of it? You will come from your place from far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses. A great horde, a mighty army, will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. Sounds like something you might see in an Avengers movie. In days to come, Gog, I will bring you against my land so that the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you before their eyes. What's going to happen? Well, let's keep reading. This is what the Sovereign Lord says. You are the one I spoke of in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel. At that time they prophesied for years that I will bring you against them. This is what will happen in that day. When Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the Sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. Fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and the beasts of the field, every creature that moves along the ground and all the peoples on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, and every wall will fall to the ground. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the Sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain and hailstones and burning sulfur on him and on his troops and the many nations with him. So I will show my greatness and my holiness. I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. This refrain we've read over and over and over again in the book of Ezekiel. What's happening there?
God is mad.
God is mad.
Again.
Now, through most of the book of Ezekiel, he's been pretty angry.
Yes, over and over again.
Over and over again. Who's he been angry at?
Everybody. Israel.
Everybody, but especially at Israel. Starts out being angry at Israel. And he destroys Israel, brings her up into captivity, and then brings her back and restores her in the land. And then all of the nations come around and say, we will plunder her. But God protects her. And that's where you have the earthquake and the hail and all of this drama. Now, you can see why, as Maury mentioned, in 1980 and 1984, this whole thing was imagined to be of the Soviet Union coming down to attack Israel, and the U.S. was going, again, the Valley of Megiddo and this whole story. Because the people reading that, well, they were kind of taking present politics and the book of Ezekiel and putting them on top of each other. In a sense, they were kind of writing a book of Revelation, but in their own present political, religious context. And it proved to not be right. And so if we were to faithfully execute the test of a prophet in Deuteronomy 18, what ought we to do? Kill him. Well, I'm not recommending we kill Al Lindsay, but shouldn't listen to them either. But this is what's going on with this. Well, now, we might listen to this and say, well, this is all funny business. But what does it have to do with us? Why would Jerusalem be called the navel of the world? And why would Jesus ascend? And what does that mean in terms of this whole story? Well, let me keep reading, and don't have a lot of time. Son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Gog, chief priest of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn around and drag you along. I will bring you out from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. This is a redux, we're repeating. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. On the mountains of Israel you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you, and I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds and wild animals. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. I will send fire on Magog and on those who live in safety in the coastland, and they will know that I am the Lord. I will make known my holy name from among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned. The nations will know that I, the Lord, am the Holy One of Israel. It is coming. It will surely take place, declares the sovereign Lord. This is the day I have spoken of. Now, if we've read lots of other Old Testament prophecies, when he keeps talking about the day, we hear this all the time. Any idea what we're talking about? Book of Joel talks about the day of the Lord. Peter, and in the book of Acts chapter 2, his Pentecost sermon, talks about the day of the Lord. I just watched the Avengers Infinity Wars last night. And after watching that and reading the book of Ezekiel, you have to say, we still talk this way. We just talk this way in the movies. And you might say, well, that's interesting, because if there's anything Marvel is really good at right now, it's making money. Because, boy, I'll tell you, these Infinity movies and the Marvel comic movies, these make billions of dollars. And as I read the Old Testament prophets and I watch these movies, I think the movies are just updating of this same genre. It's enormously popular, but we're just not used to understanding it in this ancient form that we're reading here. Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, the small and the large shields, the bows and the arrows, the war clubs and the spears. For 7 years they will use them as fuel. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut from the forest, because they will use the weapons as fuel. What does this have to do with anything? What is it saying?
Like, why don't you just say, hey, I'm mad at you?
No, but there's an image here. So the idea is that all of these nations will come against Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the navel of the world. Well, what does that mean, it's the navel of the world? What is it connected to? To God. And so the nations are coming against, even from Tarshish, coming against Jerusalem, and they're going to fight against her with a massive army. But what happens? Well, God fights for her. Actually, we see this kind of thing again and again in the Old Testament. You know, the plagues are like this. Stories from, Israel coming into the land when, nations turn against each other. They're like this. I mean, basically, all of these nations come to Israel and they're going to attack her, and God destroys the army. The armies were so vast and the people so gone that, now if you're in the ancient world, one of the things you have to do if you want a fire is you have to go out and you have to get wood to burn. Well, you don't have to go out and chop trees down. Why? Because outside the city, it's all the old weapons. It's like, why go cut a tree when I can just take all these spears and arrows and burn them for my food, and you can do that for 7 years. Well, what's that saying?
There's an awful lot of stuff.
That's an awful lot of stuff.
And they're powerless.
And they're completely powerless. And the people in the navel of the world are, well, they just weren't even touched. The children are going out and pulling these things in. They weren't destroyed by this nation. Well, what's this a vision of? And what does it have to do with when Jesus ascends into heaven? Well, what does that mean? Think about the stories of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego won't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's image. So Nebuchadnezzar says, I'll throw you into the fiery furnace. So he throws them into the fiery furnace, and what?
They don't burn.
They don't burn.
And there's a fourth one there.
And there's a fourth one there. And he looks like someone from heaven. Well, there's the umbilical, isn't there? This is the image of the umbilical that, you can, it's basically an image that says, humanity is nothing compared to God. And God is sovereign and decides. And this is a prophecy of hope for God's people that God will maintain Israel as the navel of the world. Now, we were talking about Zionists and dispensationalists. Dispensationalists continue to say Jerusalem is the navel of the world. Now, if you want to get into a theological squabble, Roman Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran, Orthodox, all disagree with that. And our disagreement with that has everything to do with the ascension. Because we say something happened in the New Testament that changed the story. Who are God's chosen people? Who are the children of Abraham? Church. Jesus, what the story of Jesus does is change this story from a story about ethnocentrism of Jerusalem into a story about Jesus and his community.
But didn't Jesus come to save the Jews and the Gentiles?
Yes.
It's not geographically.
Right. When Jesus ascends into heaven, what part of the world does he rule over?
All of it.
When Christians began to say Jesus is Lord instead of Caesar is Lord, and Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, what were they saying?
For all the nations.
Jesus rules over all the nations. And what happens is that this Old Testament, see now Jerusalem and the Jews were the navel of the world for the Old Testament. Why does Jesus have 12 disciples?
All tribes.
Jesus and his disciples are the new Israel. And the church becomes the navel of the world. Now, what would that mean?
Whoever's in the church is part of Jesus and God's community.
That's right. And now the church functions as Israel, in a sense, functioned in the Old Testament. The church becomes the navel of the world. Now, here's a funny thing about the church. Where is the church?
Well, when you put it like that, the church is everywhere.
Yes, it is. In fact, you don't have to do a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to find God. So the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. The eunuch goes all the way in the book of Acts to Jerusalem because he's looking for God. And he gets turned away at the temple because he's been sexually altered. So he can't go into the temple. So he's on his chariot going back home reading the book of Isaiah. And the Lord brings the deacon Philip to meet him and says, do you want someone to explain this? And he says, yes. And he tells them about Jesus. And the Ethiopian eunuch said, is there anything that gets in the way of me being baptized? Well, what does that mean? means that in the waters of baptism, the church is the navel of the world, and it's no longer centered in Jerusalem. Here's a fun little tidbit for you. Every other major world religion has, well, why is it so important to the Jews that Jerusalem be their capital and that this be recognized by the United States by moving its embassy there?
Hanging on to that old belief.
Every other major religion in the world, Judaism is based in Jerusalem. Where is Islam based? Mecca. Where is Hinduism based? India. Where is Buddhism based? Asia. There's only one major world religion whose, in a sense, geographic center has continued to move around the world culturally. That's Christianity. Now, some might argue Rome, yeah, but is the Roman Catholic Church all of the church?
No.
Some might argue the ancient sees of orthodoxy, but most of those are now in the Muslim world, the Islamic world. Christianity has continued to move culturally all around the world. If I were to ask you today, where is the center of Christianity? Be hard pressed. In fact, Europe wouldn't be a very good option. There are 5 times more Anglicans in Nigeria than in England. Think about that sometime. So that one of the churches that uses our facilities on Sunday afternoon is a Nigerian Anglican church. Another church is a Tongan Wesleyan church. There are more Christians in the developing world than in the first world. Christianity is growing like crazy in Asia and Africa. Not so fast in Europe or North America. What does all this mean? The church is the navel of the world, not a city. And the ascension has everything to do about that. Because the idea is Jesus, when he ascends, rules what? The world. And this whole story in Ezekiel gets appropriated by the New Testament and says, now it's interesting because it says 2 things. In a sense, this story is about, okay, after exile, Israel will be cured and God will protect her. Here's a question. Did God protect Jesus? It's complicated, huh?
Well, when you look at it from a person that don't like pain, he got protected because he could stand the pain and still pray and say, forgive them. So I don't know. He was pretty protected to me.
Yes and no. And so then, when you look at the church, a lot of people might want to read these 2 chapters in the book of Ezekiel and say, God won't let anything bad happen to her church. Well, I would say, okay, you got to read Ezekiel, but you have to read Ezekiel through Christ. And that's in a sense what we find in the book of Revelation. Because what happens with Jesus is that, does God protect Jesus? Yes. Does protection mean there won't be great suffering?
No.
No. So what exactly is God protecting?
His vision.
His vision. His kingdom. And right now, his kingdom looks like Jesus' life. What did Jesus' life look like? Suffering. Now, most of the time when we look at, when I put it in these phrases, and I say, well, being a Christian is being like Jesus. Now, people automatically go to different places. Oh, Jesus was tolerant. I kind of pause there and say, well, no, Jesus did love outcasts. But that doesn't mean Jesus was Zen. Zen kind of means whatever. That wasn't Jesus at all. Jesus was very emotional. Jesus had very strong opinions. Jesus said alarming things about prostitutes and tax collectors, who are the outgroups in terms of their own culture war. But Jesus also had strong things to say about just about everyone else. So it's not easy to simplify Jesus and to quantify him immediately. So when I say being a Christian means being like Jesus, then you say, well, Jesus did miracles and had power and walked on water. Yeah, that's true too. But that's not the only thing. You have to look at the whole package. And when I say things like, what being a Christian means is that if you live as Jesus lived, you will get what Jesus got. And then we automatically try to think about, well, what did Jesus get?
That we want.
Exactly. What did Jesus get that we want? Well, Jesus got the cross, and Jesus got resurrection. We said, well, I'd like this. I'd like to avoid this if we could. Well, did Jesus want to avoid this?
Yes.
Yes. So it's not a bad thing to want to avoid it. You are like Christ if you want to avoid this. Being a Christian is not being a masochist. But Jesus wanted to avoid it, but he didn't find a way around it. And the story is told in a way that Jesus had everyone along the way is trying to talk Jesus out of this. The disciples say, don't go to Jerusalem. Jesus is on trial with Pilate. Pilate's like, why don't you talk to me? I know you haven't done anything deserving death.
I have the power to free you.
That's right. I have the power to free you. If you'd only cut me a deal, be a little bit corrupt, Jesus, just a little bit corrupt, then I'll get you off here, because we all know what Pilate's motivation is. I'm really not looking to necessarily do the Jews a favor. It's not what I'm here for. I'm a middle Roman, I'm just a petty Roman who's trying to work his way up the Roman ladder. And I got a little bit of conscience, and I know you haven't done anything. If you make it in my interest to let you off, I'll let you off, but you got to work with me here. And Jesus doesn't. So, he goes to the cross, risen from the dead. In a sense, Jesus says, if you live my life, you will live my death, and you will live my resurrection. Now, we materialists hear that and say, I don't know if I like that deal, because this is easy to see, but I actually have to believe something kind of countercultural to imagine this. Let's pray. Lord, we love this prophecy in the book of Ezekiel because we very much want to imagine ourselves protected from harm. And there are many stories in which your people are protected from harm. But there are more stories in which your people are brought into harm, and it's through the cross that you actually do the real work of redemption and evangelism. So Lord, help us to follow Jesus in his life, follow Jesus in his death, and follow Jesus in his resurrection and even in his ascension. Because we believe that we have a brother who is sitting at the right hand of God. Help us, Lord, to believe the story, and help us, Lord, to live the story. Hear our prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.